They came to Earth expecting nothing. The Krell Dominion had mapped our little blue world centuries before we split the atom, catalogued us as a developmental species barely worthy of observation, and moved on to conquer systems that actually mattered. We were insects to them, simple creatures fumbling in the dirt while empires rose and fell among the stars. They had faster-than-light travel when we were still burning witches. They had mastered genetic engineering when we were bloodletting our sick. By every measurable standard in the Galactic Council's extensive databases, humanity was primitive, unremarkable, and utterly beneath notice. But the Krell made a mistake that would echo across 1,000 worlds. They assumed that because we developed slowly, we had nothing worth fearing. They forgot that evolution doesn't care about speed. It cares about survival. The war had been raging for 17 years before it touched our atmosphere. The Krell versus the Thaylen Confederacy, two massive powers locked in a conflict that consumed entire star systems like kindling. Billions died in skirmishes we couldn't even detect from Earth. Planets were glassed, space stations reduced to debris fields, and still the war ground on with the inevitability of a collapsing star. Neither side could gain the upper hand. The Thaylen were brilliant tacticians, masters of defensive warfare who could make every parsec of space cost the Krell dearly. But the Krell had numbers, had the industrial might of 600 conquered species, and most importantly, they had momentum. They were winning, slowly but certainly, and everyone in the galaxy knew it. Everyone except humanity, because we didn't even know there was a galaxy to know about. The day first contact happened wasn't supposed to be first contact at all. A Krell battle fleet, wounded and desperate after a Pyrrhic victory in the Outer Rim, needed somewhere to resupply. Somewhere the Thaylen wouldn't think to look. Somewhere so backward, so irrelevant, that it existed outside the scope of civilized warfare. They chose Earth. 300 warships dropped out of hyperspace above our planet on a Tuesday morning in March, and every government on Earth simultaneously soiled their contingency plans. The ships were enormous, each one larger than our biggest cities, their hulls scarred with weapons fire that could atomize mountains. They hung in orbit like dark moons, blotting out the sun over entire hemispheres, and they broadcast a message in 1,000 Earth languages that our finest linguists hadn't even finished cataloging yet. The message was simple and carried the weight of absolute authority. Earth was now a resource depot for the Krell Dominion. We would provide raw materials, water, organic compounds, and labor. Resistance would result in orbital bombardment. Compliance would result in a swift exit from our system and the continuation of our species. They gave us 72 hours to respond. The world descended into chaos. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to surrender immediately. The United Nations became a screaming match of diplomatic protocol meeting existential terror. Religious leaders proclaimed the end times. Conspiracy theorists felt simultaneously vindicated and terrified. And in military command centers across the globe, generals and admirals stared at threat assessments that used terms like complete annihilation and zero probability of survival, with the clinical precision of people describing mathematical certainty. But something else was happening in those 72 hours, something the Krell's sophisticated sensors and predictive algorithms completely missed. Humanity was remembering what it meant to be human. We didn't have energy shields or plasma cannons. We didn't have artificial gravity or quantum computers. What we had was 4 billion years of evolution on a death world that killed 99% of every species that ever existed. We had survived ice ages and supervolcanoes, plagues and predators, our own stupidity and our own brilliance in equal measure. We had climbed from the caves to the stars on a ladder built from the bones of every creature that thought it could kill us. And now these arrogant children of easier worlds, these species who'd never known what it meant to be prey, were treating us like cattle. They were about to learn the most important lesson in humanity's long and bloody history. We don't fight fair. We fight to win. The response came exactly 72 hours later, broadcast from every radio telescope and satellite transmitter on Earth. The message was even simpler than the Krell's ultimatum: delivered in their own language by a UN translator who spoke each word with perfect clarity. No. Just that single word, repeated 3 times, and then silence. In the command ship of the Krell fleet, Warprime Kelthak felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 centuries of conquest. Confusion. Primitives didn't say no. They begged, they negotiated, they collapsed into infighting. They didn't refuse with the casual confidence of equals. He checked the data again, certain there had been some translation error, but the linguistic AI confirmed it. The humans had rejected the Dominion's mercy. Very well. If they wanted to join the countless other forgotten species who'd chosen extinction over cooperation, the Krell were more than happy to oblige. Kelthak gave the order to begin bombardment. He expected it to take less than an hour. It would take 7 years, cost him everything he'd ever built, and end with his ships burning in Earth's atmosphere while human pilots screamed war cries in languages older than his empire. But in that moment, staring at the blue world below, he had no idea that he'd just made the worst tactical decision in galactic history. The humans weren't preparing to die. They were preparing to teach the galaxy what humanity actually meant. The first kinetic strikes hit major population centers at dawn. Rods of tungsten accelerated to relativistic speeds, designed to vaporize cities with surgical precision while leaving resources intact. Beijing, Moscow, New York, London, Delhi, Lagos. The Krell had calculated that eliminating government centers would collapse human resistance within hours. They had based these calculations on 17,000 previous conquests across 400 years. Every single projection showed the same result. Total capitulation by day's end. But the Krell had never fought an enemy that had spent its entire existence fighting itself. Humans had been perfecting the art of warfare for 10,000 years against the only opponent that truly understood how humans think. Other humans. We knew every dirty trick, every desperate gambit, every last-ditch strategy that could turn defeat into survival, because we'd already tried them all on each other. When the strikes hit, they killed 300 million people in the first 6 minutes. It was the worst disaster in human history. It was also the moment humanity stopped being divided nations and became something the galaxy had never seen before. A unified species with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The retaliation came before the dust had settled. Every nuclear-armed submarine on Earth surfaced simultaneously and launched their full payload, not at the planet, but straight up. Hundreds of missiles screaming toward orbit on pillars of fire, primitive fusion weapons that the Krell's defensive systems barely registered as threats. They shot down 97% of them with laser point defense systems, their AI calculating trajectories with contemptuous ease. But 3% of several hundred is still a lot of nuclear weapons, and the Krell had made their second fatal mistake. They had assumed that because our weapons were primitive, they were ineffective. They had never considered that primitive simply meant proven. 12 nuclear warheads detonated in the midst of their formation, and while the ship's shields held against the thermal radiation, the electromagnetic pulses cascaded through their systems like wildfire through dry grass. Ship after ship went dark, their sophisticated electronics fried by phenomena that humanity had been studying since the 1940s. In 30 seconds, humanity had reduced the Krell's orbital superiority by 18% using technology we developed before we'd even reached our own moon. Warprime Kelthak stared at his displays as damage reports flooded in from ships that shouldn't have been vulnerable to anything Earth possessed, and felt his second unfamiliar emotion in as many days. Doubt. But humanity wasn't done. Not even close. While the Krell scrambled to restore power to their damaged vessels, something else was rising from Earth's surface. Not missiles this time, but something far more dangerous. Information. Every satellite, every radio transmitter, every bit of communications infrastructure humanity possessed suddenly focused on a single task. Broadcasting everything we knew about the Krell fleet to anyone who might be listening. Ship configurations, weapon signatures, formation patterns, shield frequencies, even the specific damage locations on their hulls from whatever battle had driven them to Earth in the first place. We didn't know if anyone was out there. We didn't know if anyone would care. But humans have always understood one fundamental truth about warfare. The enemy of my enemy is a potential asset, and intelligence is the most valuable weapon in any conflict. 3 light hours away, a Thalen listening post picked up the transmissions. The analysts couldn't believe what they were seeing. The primitive species Earth was broadcasting military intelligence of such precision and detail that their own scouts would have needed months to gather. And they were just giving it away, screaming it into the void in every direction, practically begging for someone to use it. The Thalen Confederacy had been looking for the Krell fleet for 6 weeks. Now they knew exactly where it was, how badly it was damaged, and thanks to humanity's nuclear ambush, which ships had compromised systems. The Thalen task force went to full burn immediately, calculating jump coordinates that would bring them into Earth's system in less than 40 hours. They expected to find a smoking ruin and a triumphant Krell fleet. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of warfare itself. On Earth, the survivors were adapting with the terrifying speed that only a species facing extinction can muster. The Krell had expected chaos, but they found something worse. Organization born from pure spite. Every factory that could be retooled was producing weapons. Not sophisticated energy weapons or particle beams, but bullets. Millions upon millions of bullets, artillery shells, rockets, anything that could throw metal at high velocity. The Krell could vaporize our planes before they reached orbit. Fine. We'd shoot them with ground-based weapons. They could destroy our bases faster than we could build them. Fine. We'd operate out of caves and tunnels and basements, the same way guerrillas had fought for centuries. They had superior technology. We had 7 billion people who'd all independently decided that dying while taking Krell with them was preferable to living as slaves. Military commanders from every surviving nation pooled their knowledge into a single strategic database, centuries of human military doctrine from Sun Tzu to Clausewitz to modern insurgency warfare, all filtered through one lens. How do you kill something vastly stronger than you? And humanity, violent, creative, absolutely unhinged humanity, started providing answers that made even hardened generals uncomfortable. The Krell sent down landing parties to secure resource deposits, expecting token resistance at best. They met something that would haunt Dominion military academies for generations. Human beings fighting with the coordinated viciousness of pack predators, using every advantage of terrain, weather, and local knowledge to turn each engagement into a meat grinder. The Krell had better armor, better weapons, better everything. But humans had home field advantage on a planet that had been trying to kill us since we climbed down from the trees. We led them into swamps that swallowed their vehicles. We collapsed tunnels on their heads. We used their own sensors against them, learning to predict their movements and preparing ambushes that turned their tactical superiority into a liability. And most horrifying of all to the Krell, we kept coming. They would clear a sector, eliminate all resistance, and move on, only to have humans return the moment they left, rebuilding, rearming, ready to do it all over again. It wasn't warfare as the galaxy understood it. It was evolution in real time, humanity adapting to a threat the way our ancestors had adapted to every predator that ever hunted us. By refusing to die until we'd learned to hunt them back. Warprime Kelthak watched his casualty reports climb day by day and realized that he'd committed the greatest military blunder possible. He'd given a desperate enemy time to learn. And humans, it turned out, were very, very fast learners. The Thalen fleet arrived in Earth's system 38 hours after receiving humanity's broadcast, and what they found defied every combat doctrine in their 1,000-year military history. The Krell fleet was still in orbit, still overwhelmingly superior in firepower, still capable of reducing Earth to ash. But they weren't winning. They were bleeding. Hundreds of small craft swarmed around the massive warships like angry hornets, converted civilian spacecraft that had no business being in a military engagement. Shuttles with welded-on missile pods. Personal yachts rigged with explosives, piloted by volunteers on one-way trips. Communication satellites reprogrammed to ram into Krell point defense systems. The humans were using everything, wasting nothing, and most incredibly, they were learning from every engagement. The Thaylen combat analysts watched targeting data that showed human attack patterns evolving in real time, adapting to Krell responses with a speed that should have required artificial intelligence. But it wasn't AI. It was millions of human minds networked together, sharing data, iterating tactics, dying and passing their lessons to the next wave in a continuous cycle of violent innovation. Commander Thela of the Thaylen flagship had fought the Krell for 9 years. She'd won battles, lost friends, seen entire colonies reduced to memory. But she'd never seen anyone fight like this. Not with this raw, creative, absolutely insane determination to make every death count for something. She opened a channel to Earth, broadcasting on all frequencies, and spoke words that would change the course of galactic history. Humans of Earth, this is Commander Thela of the Thaylen Confederacy. We are here to engage the Krell fleet. If you can hear this, fall back. Let us handle this. The response came back in under 10 seconds, audio only, a voice roughened by smoke and exhaustion. Negative, Thaylen fleet. We're going to help you kill every last one of them. Adjust your fire. We're coming in. And they did. The Thaylen had expected to fight alongside primitives who needed protection. Instead, they found themselves coordinating with pilots who flew like demons, who understood three-dimensional combat instinctively because they'd been doing it in atmosphere their entire lives, who could read the flow of battle and adapt in ways that the Thaylen's methodical tactical doctrine simply couldn't match. When the Thaylen's shields failed under Krell bombardment, human ships threw themselves into the line of fire, buying seconds with their lives. When Krell fighters broke through the Thaylen formation, human interceptors met them with the kind of reckless courage that either gets you killed instantly or turns you into a legend. The battle lasted 14 hours, and when it was over, 90% of the Krell fleet was destroyed or captured. The Thaylen had lost 30 ships. The humans had lost 8,000 craft and 42,000 lives. But they'd won. Against an enemy that had conquered 600 species, using weapons that shouldn't have mattered, humanity had fought an interstellar empire to a standstill and emerged victorious. The aftermath was chaos of a different kind. Warprime Kelthak, his flagship crippled and burning, stood before a communication screen showing Commander Thela and 5 human military leaders who'd survived the bombardment. He expected execution, or at least imprisonment. What he got was worse. Questions. The humans wanted to know everything about the Krell Dominion, about the war, about the galaxy beyond their little blue world. They asked about propulsion systems and weapons technology, about Dominion military structure and supply lines, about the Thaylen Confederacy and every other species involved in the conflict. And they absorbed the information with the hungry intensity of minds that had just realized their universe was infinitely larger and more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Kelthak answered, partly because he was beaten and partly because he was curious to see what these terrifying creatures would do with the knowledge. When they asked how the Krell had achieved faster-than-light travel, he explained the principles. When they asked how energy shields worked, he outlined the mathematics. And when they asked how to build weapons capable of fighting a galactic war, he told them the truth. You can't. It takes centuries to develop the infrastructure, the industrial base, the theoretical knowledge. Even with our help, your species won't be a relevant military power for at least 100 years. The human general on the screen, a scarred woman named Shen, smiled in a way that made Kelthak's scales itch with instinctive unease. General Kelthak, 3 weeks ago we thought we were alone in the universe. Yesterday we helped destroy a fleet that had conquered 600 species. How long do you really think it will take us? The answer came faster than anyone predicted. 6 months after the Battle of Earth, human engineers had reverse-engineered enough Krell technology from the captured ships to launch their first faster-than-light vessel. It was crude, inefficient, and required twice the power of equivalent Dominion ships. But it worked. 3 months after that, human ships started appearing in combat zones across the galaxy, always on the Thaylen side, always fighting with that same desperate innovation that had characterized the defense of Earth. The galaxy watched in stunned disbelief as this newly discovered species that should have been either enslaved or destroyed instead threw itself into a war that wasn't even theirs, simply because someone had attacked them first and they had decided to take it personally. The Krell Dominion, which had been on the verge of defeating the Thaylen Confederacy, suddenly found itself fighting a two-front war against an enemy that didn't fight by any rules they recognized. Humans didn't honor the conventions of warfare that had evolved over thousands of years of galactic conflict. They didn't respect sanctuary zones or diplomatic immunity. They didn't follow predictable tactical doctrine or recognize when they were beaten. They fought like cornered animals, except animals didn't build nuclear weapons and strap them to asteroids, didn't hack into enemy communication networks and broadcast psychological warfare that made Krell soldiers question their empire, didn't look at a superior enemy force and think, I wonder if we can trick them into shooting each other. The Dominion had spent 400 years conquering species that fought with honor, with tradition, with the assumption that warfare had rules. Humanity had spent 10,000 years fighting itself and had long ago abandoned any notion that survival had rules beyond one. Win. The war turned. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it turned. Systems the Krell had held for decades suddenly became contested as human-designed tactics gave the Thaylen new options they'd never considered. Weapons that the Dominion had thought obsolete became devastating in human hands, used in ways that violated every principle of civilized warfare and were brutally effective because of it. And most importantly, humanity brought something to the war that neither side had possessed. Hope. The Thaylen had been fighting a defensive war for 17 years, slowly losing ground, watching their species edge toward extinction. Now they had allies who genuinely believed they could win, because humans had never learned how to think any other way. You don't survive 4 billion years of evolution on a death world by accepting defeat. You survive by being too stupid, too stubborn, or too crazy to die. And humanity had all three in abundance. 3 years after first contact, War Prime Kelthak, now a prisoner-turned-advisor, sat in a human military installation and watched tactical displays that showed Dominion forces in full retreat across 6 sectors. He turned to General Chen, who'd kept him alive specifically to answer questions about Krell military doctrine, and asked the question that had haunted him since the Battle of Earth. How? How did a primitive species do in 3 years what the Thaylen couldn't do in 17? Chen poured him a glass of something called whiskey, a human intoxicant that Kelthak had developed an unfortunate fondness for, and answered with brutal honesty. Because we didn't know we were primitive. You told us we were insects, and we took it as a challenge. That was your mistake, Kelthak. You gave angry apes access to starships and expected us to be grateful. Instead, we decided to show you what angry apes can do when someone threatens their home. The war ended 7 years after it reached Earth, but the cost was measured in more than just the numbers. The Krell Dominion, which had ruled 600 species for 4 centuries, collapsed not from military defeat but from something more insidious. The idea that humanity represented. You could fight the Dominion and win. Every species they'd conquered watched as this primitive backwater world not only survived but thrived, and suddenly the calculations changed. If the humans could do it, why couldn't they? Rebellions erupted across Dominion space, each one learning from human tactics, each one refusing to accept the inevitability of Krell's superiority. The Dominion, built on the certainty of their own supremacy, crumbled under the weight of doubt. But victory came with a price that humanity was still learning to calculate. Earth was scarred. 300 million dead in the initial bombardment. Another billion lost in the 7 years of sporadic Krell attacks before they finally retreated. Cities reduced to rubble. Ecosystems devastated. Entire regions of the planet rendered uninhabitable by weapons humanity was still learning to pronounce. And beyond the physical damage was something deeper, something that couldn't be measured in casualty reports or reconstruction estimates. Humanity had learned that we weren't alone, and we'd learned it in the worst possible way. Our first contact with alien life had been attempted genocide. That kind of trauma doesn't heal quickly, not for a species that had spent its entire existence assuming we were the center of creation. The psychological impact rippled through every level of society. Some humans embraced our new role as galactic warriors, threw themselves into military service with the fervor of religious converts. Others retreated inward, rejected space travel entirely, demanded that Earth close its borders and never speak to the stars again. Children grew up with nightmares of ships in the sky. Artists created works that tried to process the impossible grief of planetary trauma. Philosophers questioned everything from human nature to our place in the cosmos. And the survivors, the ones who'd fought in those first desperate days, carried scars that no medical technology could heal. They'd done things that peacetime humanity had only imagined in its darkest fiction. They'd rammed civilian ships into enemy vessels. They'd collapsed tunnels on their own people to trap Krell soldiers. They'd made choices that saved millions by sacrificing thousands, and they had to live with those calculations for the rest of their lives. General Chen, hailed as the hero of Earth by a grateful planet, stood in the ruins of Beijing and felt nothing but exhaustion. She'd saved humanity. She'd also ordered actions that killed tens of thousands of her own people when the tactical situation demanded it. History would remember her as a savior. She remembered every name on every casualty report she'd signed. That was the price of victory. Not death, but the memory of death. Not fear, but the knowledge of what you're capable of when fear runs out. But humanity, as always, adapted. We rebuilt. Not just our cities, but ourselves. The war had forced technological advancement that should have taken centuries into less than a decade. We went from our first faster-than-light ship to a fleet of 200 vessels in 6 years. We went from fragmented nations to something approaching unified global governance because we'd learned the hard way that divided, we were vulnerable. We took the wreckage of Krell ships and learned to build our own. We took the tactical knowledge they tried to use against us and made it ours. And most importantly, we took our place at the table when the galaxies started discussing what came next. The Galactic Council, which had dismissed humanity as primitive barely a decade ago, now found themselves negotiating with human diplomats who'd earned their seat not through ancient heritage or technological sophistication, but through the most basic credential the galaxy recognized: the ability to survive. The first council session humanity attended was tense. 200 species, some of whom had been members for millennia, watching as these newcomers took seats that the Krell Dominion had once occupied. Ambassador Williams, a former Marine who'd lost both legs in the Battle of Earth and refused prosthetics as a reminder of what they'd survived, stood before the assembled council and delivered humanity's opening statement with the blunt honesty that was becoming humanity's trademark in galactic politics. We didn't want this. We didn't ask to join your community. You came to us, threatened us, and forced us to become something we weren't ready to be. We lost over 1 billion people learning that the universe is a hostile place filled with species that have forgotten what it means to fight for survival. But we learned. And now we're here, and we're not going anywhere. You can work with us, or you can work around us, but you will never again make the mistake of thinking that humanity is too primitive to matter. The chamber erupted in protest, in agreement, in confusion. Some species saw humanity as dangerous upstarts. Others saw potential allies. A few saw exactly what the Krell had missed. A species that had been forged in the kind of crucible that most galactic civilizations had forgotten existed, tempered by violence into something that couldn't be predicted by any existing model of sapient behavior. Commander Thela, representing the Thalian Confederacy, stood and addressed the council with words that would define the new galactic order. 7 years ago, I thought humanity was a tragic curiosity. A species that would be extinct within a week. Instead, they became the allies that saved my civilization. They fight like nothing we've ever encountered because they've never known a universe where someone wasn't trying to kill them. Every predator on their world, every disease, every environmental catastrophe, every war they fought against themselves, all of it prepared them for the moment the Krell arrived. They're not primitive. They're survivors. And I think it's time we stopped measuring civilizations by how long they've had technology and started measuring them by what they do when everything is on the line. The vote to grant humanity full council membership passed with 73% approval. It wasn't universal, it wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough. Earth had gone from unlisted primitive world to recognized galactic power in 7 years. Not through clever diplomacy or cultural exchange, but through the most ancient and brutal method known to any species. Trial by fire. But even as humanity celebrated their official recognition, even as Earth rebuilt and the fleet expanded and the future looked brighter than anyone had dared hope during those first terrible days, there were voices of caution. Scientists who warned that humanity's rapid advancement was unstable, that we were building on foundations we didn't fully understand. Philosophers who questioned whether we'd grown too comfortable with violence, whether the species that had fought so desperately for peace had become the thing we'd fought against. And veterans who looked at the celebration and felt the weight of absent friends, the ghosts of 300 million dead, the cost that had bought humanity's seat at the galactic table. They'd won. But winning, they were learning, was just another kind of loss. The kind you have to live with. The kind that shapes everything that comes after. Earth was no longer primitive in the galaxy's eyes. But humanity was still learning what it meant to be civilized in a universe that measured civilization by your ability to destroy your enemies. And that lesson, more than any technology or tactical doctrine, would define what humanity became in the centuries to follow. 50 years after first contact, Earth had become something no one could have predicted. Not the smoking ruin the Krell expected. Not the grateful client state the Thalen might have hoped for. Instead, humanity had carved out a role in galactic civilization that was uniquely our own. We were the military specialists, the tactical innovators, the species you called when conventional warfare failed and you needed someone who thought about combat the way a puzzle solver thinks about impossible problems. Human military academies trained officers from 200 species in what they called adaptive warfare doctrine, which was really just a fancy term for the controlled chaos that came naturally to a species that had spent millennia fighting itself. Human ships served in peacekeeping fleets across the galaxy, not because we were the strongest but because we'd proven we couldn't be intimidated. And human veterans, scarred by the war that had introduced us to the stars, worked as consultants and advisors and occasionally therapists for species learning to cope with the trauma of combat. We'd become the galaxy's experts in surviving the unsurvivable, because we'd done it while the rest of the galaxy was watching. But the war's shadow stretched long across human civilization. The generation that had fought the Krell was aging now, their stories becoming legend, their warnings becoming ignored by young people who'd never seen a Krell warship in Earth's sky. There was a push among some human factions to expand, to claim more territory, to leverage our military reputation into political power. They looked at the council and saw weakness, saw species that had grown soft from centuries of peace before the war, and they whispered that humanity could do better. That we could rule, not just participate. General Chen, now retired and teaching at the new Beijing Military Academy, recognized the signs. She'd spent 50 years watching as the defensive fury that had saved Earth slowly transformed into something else. Pride. Arrogance. The belief that because we'd won one war against impossible odds, we were somehow special. Chosen. Superior. It was the same logic the Krell had used, and it terrified her more than any alien invasion ever had. She wrote an essay that became required reading at every military institution on Earth and in the colonies. We survived, but we are not special, became the manifesto for a generation trying to navigate humanity's place in the galaxy without losing their humanity in the process. In it, she detailed every mistake they'd made, every civilian casualty, every moral compromise that victory had required. And she ended with a warning that resonated across human space. The Krell thought they were superior because they'd conquered 600 species. We beat them, and now some of us think that makes us superior. But that's not why we won. We won because we were desperate, not because we were better. The moment we forget that desperation, the moment we start believing our own legend, we become the next dominion. And there will be another species, somewhere out there, that will teach us the same lesson we taught the Krell. That survival doesn't care about superiority. It only cares about adaptation. The essay sparked debates that raged for years. Some called Chen a defeatist, accused her of undermining human confidence when we needed it most. Others saw it as the voice of hard-won wisdom, a reminder that the galaxy didn't owe humanity anything just because we'd survived. But its impact was undeniable. It forced humanity to confront what we'd become and what we wanted to be. Not just survivors anymore, but participants in something larger. Not just warriors, but builders. The decision came gradually, without any single defining moment. Humanity would be strong, but not aggressive. Innovative, but not reckless. Proud of what we'd accomplished, but not blind to the cost. We'd maintain the fleet, keep the military sharp, because the galaxy had taught us the price of unpreparedness. But we'd also invest in science, in art, in the kind of cultural development that we'd had to abandon when the Krell arrived. We'd be ready for war, but we wouldn't make it our identity. It was a balance that no species had ever really achieved, the knife's edge between preparedness and militarism. But humanity had always specialized in the impossible. On the 75th anniversary of First Contact, a monument was unveiled in orbit around Earth. A massive structure built from the wreckage of both Krell and human ships, twisted metal transformed into something beautiful and terrible. At its center was a list of names. Every human who'd died in the war. Every Krell soldier who'd fallen in the initial invasion. Every Thaylen warrior who'd sacrificed themselves in the Battle of Earth. 300 million humans. 40,000 Krell. 8,000 Thaylen. Each name engraved with the same precision, given the same honor, because as Ambassador Williams had argued during the monument's design phase, everyone who died in a war is someone's loss. Even your enemy. Especially your enemy, because remembering their humanity is how you keep from becoming them. The dedication ceremony brought together beings from across the galaxy. Former enemies, current allies, species that had only heard about Earth through rumor and wanted to see this world that had changed everything. Commander Thela was there, ancient now by Thaylen standards, her carapace scarred by a lifetime of warfare. War Prime Kelthak, who'd been granted asylum on Earth after providing testimony that helped dismantle what remained of Dominion power structures, stood beside her. And General Chen, in the last public appearance before her death 6 months later, gave the closing speech that would define humanity's legacy for generations. 75 years ago, we learned that we weren't alone. We learned it in fire and blood and loss that still echoes through every family on Earth. We learned that the universe is vast and hostile and filled with species that don't care about our stories or our dreams. But we also learned something else. We learned that we're capable of surviving anything if we're willing to pay the price. That price is written here, in names that stretch further than anyone can see in a single glance. It's written in the scars we carry, the nightmares we wake from, the empty chairs at every table on Earth. And it's written in the choice we make every day. To remember, or to forget. To learn, or to repeat. The Krell forgot. They forgot that every species they conquered was someone's home, someone's Earth. They forgot that superiority is a story we tell ourselves to justify cruelty. They forgot that the universe doesn't care about your story. It only cares whether you survive. We survived. But survival isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. What we do with it, how we treat the species we meet, whether we remember the cost or just remember the victory, that's what will determine whether humanity becomes a force for good in this galaxy or just another dominion with better excuses. So we built this monument from the wreckage of war. Not to glorify it, but to remember it. To remember that every name here represents a world that ended, a future that died, a price that was paid so we could stand here today. We are not primitive anymore. But we're also not finished becoming what we'll be. That's a choice we make together, every day, in every action. The Krell thought we were insects. We proved them wrong. Now we have to prove something harder. That being strong doesn't mean being cruel. That surviving doesn't mean forgetting. That humanity, violent and creative and absolutely insane humanity, can be something more than what the galaxy expected. We can be what we choose to be. That's the lesson Earth learned 75 years ago. That's the gift 300 million people died to give us. The freedom to choose what comes next. So let's choose well. The crowd was silent for a long moment, thousands of beings from hundreds of species, standing in the shadow of names and remembering their own losses, their own wars, their own moments when everything hung in the balance. Then they began to applaud, a sound that started small and grew until it filled the space around Earth, until it seemed to reach the stars themselves. Not applause for victory, but for memory. For choice. For the idea that maybe, just maybe, survival could lead to something better than just more survival. Humanity had been considered primitive until the Galactic War reached Earth. Now, 75 years later, we were still learning what it meant to be anything else. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And that, more than any battle won or empire defeated, was the legacy that mattered. The choice to keep trying, keep learning, keep becoming something worth remembering. Not because we were special, but because we refused to accept that survival was the end of the story. It was just the first chapter. The rest was up to us.